every domesticated bird on Earth is dumber than its wild ancestor. Every single one. The chicken lost roughly a quarter of the brain, volume that once kept the red jungle fowl alive in the forests of Southeast Asia. The domestic duck surrendered nearly 15% of the neural tissue that guided its ancestor across open ocean. The pigeon, bred for speed and homing precision across 5,000 years of selective management, still carries a measurably smaller brain than the rock doves that nested on Mediterranean sea cliffs before humans ever stacked one stone on top of another. The trade is universal. Tameness costs brain. Brain costs tameness. No species in the history of domestication has ever escaped this exchange. Except one. One bird has lived inside human civilization for longer than the chicken, longer than the pigeon, longer than any waterfowl or game bird humans have ever corralled into a pen. It eats from our garbage. It nests on our architecture. It raises its young within meters of our own, and across 10,000 years of proximity, thousands of human generations, and every agricultural revolution the species has ever produced. Not a single human culture on any continent has managed to make this bird obedient. The crow. There are approximately 40 species in the genus Corvus distributed across every landmass on the planet except Antarctica. They occupy deserts, alpine forests, tropical coastlines, Arctic tundra, and the concrete canyons of every major city on Earth. They are among the most geographically successful vertebrates alive, outnumbered in territorial range only by humans, rats, and a handful of insect species. And they have achieved all of this without ever submitting to the species that dominates the planet. The explanation is not that crows are skittish, not that they breed poorly in confined spaces, not that they lack the social structures domestication requires. The explanation sits inside the crow's skull, packed into 10 grams of neural tissue, roughly the mass of 2 grapes resting on your kitchen counter. And what that tissue can do is the reason no domestication program has ever succeeded, and no future program ever will. But to understand why, you have to understand what domestication actually does to a brain. And the answer to that question arrived not from a bird study, but from a fox farm on the frozen outskirts of Soviet Siberia. In 1959, Dmitri Belyaev, a geneticist working at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, launched what would become the longest-running selective breeding experiment in the history of biology. He started with silver foxes, wild animals that hissed, bit, and lunged at any human hand that came near their cage. His method was blunt. Each generation, he selected the calmest 10% of the population and allowed only those animals to breed. No training, no conditioning, pure genetic selection for one behavioral trait. Reduced fear of humans. The behavioral changes arrived within a decade. Tail wagging by generation 6, whimpering for human contact by generation 15. Foxes that rolled onto their backs and solicited belly rubs like Labrador puppies by generation 20. The speed of the transformation startled even Belyaev, but the physical changes startled him more. The tame foxes developed floppy ears. Their coats broke into irregular patches of white and brown. Their snouts shortened. Their tails curled. Their adrenal glands, the organs that flood the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline during moments of danger, shrank to a fraction of their original size, and their brains got smaller. Not by a trivial margin, by a margin large enough to measure on a scale. That pattern, behavioral tameness accompanied by a constellation of physical changes, including reduced brain volume, has since been documented in every domesticated species biologists have examined. In 2014, Adam Wilkins at Humboldt University in Berlin, alongside Richard Wrangham at Harvard and W. Tecumseh Fitch at the University of Vienna, published a paper in the journal Genetics proposing a unified explanation. The mechanism they identified was neural crest cells, a population of embryonic cells that migrate across the developing body early in fetal life and give rise to the adrenal medulla, portions of the skull and jaw cartilage, melanocytes responsible for pigmentation, and critically, regions of the forebrain. When breeders select for calm animals, they are selecting for embryos with reduced neural crest cell activity. Fewer migrating neural crest cells produce smaller adrenal glands, hence the reduced stress response. But the same reduction simultaneously produces less cartilage in the ears, hence the flop. Less melanocyte distribution, hence the patchy coats. Shorter facial bones, hence the rounded juvenile faces. And diminished forebrain development, hence the cognitive losses. The entire domestication syndrome, floppy ears, curly tails, piebald coats, smaller brains, rides a single embryonic pathway. Tameness and intelligence sit on opposite ends of the same biological lever. Push one down, and the other follows. There is no known mechanism to separate them. Consider what that means for any species whose survival depends entirely on what its brain can do. A chicken that loses 24% of its brain volume can still peck grain from a trough, lay eggs on a schedule, and reproduce inside a wire enclosure. The red jungle fowl was never a cognitive powerhouse. Its brain handled predator avoidance, social hierarchy management, and basic foraging. Remove those pressures by placing the animal inside a coop with guaranteed food and no leopards, and the brain tissue that managed them quietly dissolves across generations. The chicken barely notices. A crow that lost 24% of its brain volume would cease to be a crow. The reason sits in a number that only became available in 2016, when Søren Olkewicz and a team of neuroanatomists at Charles University in Prague published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that forced ornithologists and mammalian neuroscientists alike to reconsider everything they assumed about brain size and cognitive capacity. Olkewicz's team counted the actual neurons in the brains of 28 bird species and compared the totals to neuron counts in primate brains of equivalent mass. The results were not close. A crow's 10-gram brain contains approximately 1.5 billion neurons. A macaque monkey brain, which weighs roughly 90 grams, 9 times heavier, contains about 1.7 billion neurons, nearly the same count. The crow achieves primate-level neuron density in a package the size of a shelled walnut, roughly the volume of the last joint of your thumb. The neurons are smaller, packed more tightly, and connected by shorter axons that transmit signals faster than their mammalian equivalents. That density is the engine behind every behavior that makes crows undomesticable. And the catalog of those behaviors has been growing for 2 decades at a pace that has left comparative psychologists struggling to keep up. Start with tool manufacture. In the rainforests of New Caledonia, a chain of islands roughly 1,100 kilometers east of Australia, crows of the species Corvus moneduloides craft hooked tools from the stiff, barbed edges of pandanus leaves. They cut, trim, and taper strips into implements with distinct regional designs that vary between populations the way dialects vary between human communities. Gavin Hunt at the University of Auckland first described these tools in a 1996 paper published in Nature, and subsequent fieldwork confirmed that young crows learn their local design by watching adults work. The tool-making tradition is cultural. It is transmitted socially. It is refined across generations, moved to causal reasoning. In 2009, Alex Taylor, also at the University of Auckland, presented New Caledonian crows with a transparent tube partially filled with water, at the bottom of which floated a small piece of food just out of beak reach. Beside the tube sat a pile of small stones and a pile of lightweight foam objects. The crows dropped stones into the water, raising the level until the food floated within reach. They ignored the foam. They understood that heavy objects displace water, and light objects do not. This is the logic behind Aesop's fable of the crow and the pitcher, written roughly 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. A fable, it turns out, that was not a fable at all, but an accurate behavioral observation recorded by a civilization that watched crows closely enough to notice. Taylor's team published the results in Current Biology, and the implications extended well beyond ornithology. The task requires an understanding of cause and effect, of the relationship between object properties and physical outcomes, and of the connection between a current action and a future reward. Human children do not reliably pass equivalent tests until the age of 5 to 7. Now add social cognition, the dimension that transforms a clever animal into an undomesticable one. In 2011, Thomas Bugner at the University of Vienna published a series of experiments in the journal Animal Behavior, demonstrating that ravens, the crow's closest large-bodied relative, engage in tactical deception. When a raven caches food while being watched by a dominant bird, it will return later and move the food to a new location. If no dominant bird was watching during the initial caching event, the raven does not bother relocating. The animal tracks what other individuals have seen and adjusts its own behavior based on what those individuals might do with that knowledge. Bugner called this behavior a functional analog of theory of mind, the ability to model the mental states of others. It is the cognitive foundation of deception, empathy, alliance formation, and social manipulation. Crows and ravens do not just solve physical problems. They navigate social landscapes of competing interests, shifting alliances, and individually tracked relationships. They remember who helped them, who threatened them, who watched them hide food, and who is likely to steal it. Every member of a crow's social group is filed in a mental database that updates in real time and persists across years. John Marsluff at the University of Washington demonstrated the persistent side of this equation in an experiment that began in 2006. His team captured and banded American crows while wearing distinctive rubber masks. The captured birds were handled briefly and released unharmed. In the months and years that followed, crows that had been captured and crows that had merely witnessed the capture mobbed anyone wearing the mask, diving and screaming with targeted hostility. Crows wearing different masks were ignored entirely. The discrimination was facial. The memory was social. By the time Marsluff published expanded results in 2010 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, the scolding behavior had spread to crows that had never personally witnessed the original capture. Juvenile birds born after the event attacked the mask on sight. The grudge had been inherited culturally, transmitted from parent to offspring through social learning. This is the wall that domestication cannot breach. Every selective breeding program in history has required capturing, handling, and confining animals across dozens of generations. Each capture event triggers precisely the behavior Marsluff documented. Every handler's face is cataloged. Every threat is broadcast. Every generation of crows that witnesses a capture transmits the hostility to the next generation, including birds not yet hatched at the time of the original event. You are not selecting against one animal's fear. You are selecting against a networked intelligence that updates its threat database faster than any breeding program can dilute it. Then there are the funerals. Kaylee Swift, working under Marsluff at the University of Washington, published a study in 2015 in the journal Animal Behavior describing the first controlled experiments on crow gatherings around dead conspecifics. When a crow encounters the body of another crow on the ground, it vocalizes loudly and persistently. Within minutes, dozens of crows arrive from surrounding territories. They perch in the branches overhead, calling in a sustained chorus that can last 20 minutes. They do not touch the body. They do not feed on it. They observe. Swift placed taxidermy crow specimens in locations where live crows regularly fed, paired with a researcher wearing an unfamiliar mask. After the gathering dispersed, the live crows avoided the feeding site for days. More critically, they began mobbing the masked figure on site, even in locations far from the original scene. The funerals are threat assessment events. The assembled crows are determining what killed one of their own, encoding the location and the associated human face, and distributing that information across the local population. A single dead crow and a single unfamiliar face produced a learned association that persisted for weeks and spread across an entire urban crow community. If you have been watching this far, you already understand that this channel does not cover surface-level content. You are the kind of viewer who wants to know why the systems underneath the world work the way they do. Subscribe now. The algorithm will stop recommending this content if you do not signal that you want it. And the next video examines a structure in the human body that 3 separate research teams have studied from 3 different angles without reaching the same conclusion. You do not want to miss it. Humans did not overlook crows throughout history. The relationship between the 2 species is older than agriculture and more complicated than any domestication story ever written. Aboriginal Australians, whose continuous cultural traditions stretch back at least 65,000 years, incorporated the crow into their origin narratives as a trickster figure, an agent of transformation whose cleverness reshaped the landscape. Across dozens of distinct Aboriginal language groups, the crow appears as a being who steals fire, deceives larger animals, and outwits every trap set for it. These are not fanciful projections. They are observational accounts encoded in mythological form by cultures that watched crow behavior with a precision that modern ethologists would recognize as field notes. The Norse gave Odin 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. They flew across the world each dawn and returned each evening to whisper everything they had witnessed into the god's ear. The ravens were not decorative companions. They were intelligence assets, cognitive extensions of the most powerful figure in the Norse pantheon. In the poem Grimnismal, Odin admits he fears for Munin's return more than Hugin's. Scholars interpret this as an acknowledgement that memory, the ability to retain and retrieve information across time, is more precious and more fragile than the act of thinking itself. The Vikings carried ravens aboard their longships as navigation instruments. Released from the deck in open water, a raven that flew toward the horizon and did not return signaled land ahead. A raven that circled back meant open ocean in every direction. The bird's cognitive map of its environment was more reliable than any tool the Norse possessed, centuries before the magnetic compass reached Scandinavian waters. At the Tower of London, ravens have been maintained since at least the 17th century under a tradition, possibly fabricated by Victorian romantics, but enforced as government policy since at least the 1880s, holding that the kingdom itself will fall if the ravens ever leave. 7 birds are currently maintained by a dedicated yeoman warder titled the Raven Master. Each bird receives 170 grams of raw meat daily, roughly the weight of a smartphone, supplemented with blood-soaked biscuits and raw eggs. Their flight feathers are trimmed to prevent departure, but even with clipped wings, the tower ravens remain individually unpredictable, with documented preferences for specific handlers and documented hostility toward others. One raven named Merlina, who held the position from 2007 until her disappearance in early 2021, was known for escaping her enclosure and sitting on parked cars outside the tower walls, which is either an expression of genuine boredom or a calculated act of institutional defiance, depending on how much agency you are willing to grant a bird. Meanwhile, in every city on every continent, a parallel experiment has been running for over a century, one that no human designed and no institution controls. Urban crow populations have exploded alongside human urbanization, and the cognitive behaviors they exhibit in cities have no equivalent in any domesticated species, past or present. In Sendai, Japan, carrion crows place walnuts on pedestrian crosswalks and wait for vehicles to crush the shells. They retrieve the exposed nut meat during red lights, timing their movements to the traffic signal cycle. Researchers at Tohoku University confirmed that the crows select crosswalks specifically, choosing sites where traffic signals create predictable, safe windows. The birds are reading human infrastructure and integrating it into their foraging strategy in real time. In Seattle, a population of American crows studied by Marsluff's team has demonstrated gift-giving behavior toward individual humans who provide regular food. Small objects, buttons, beads, scraps of polished glass, fragments of metal are carried to feeding sites and left for specific people. The behavior is not trained. It is not conditioned through deliberate reinforcement. The crows assess the relationship independently and reciprocate on their own terms. The moment the food stops, the gifts stop. The exchange is voluntary. The bond dissolves the instant it ceases to serve the crow's interests. That distinction defines the entire story. A domesticated animal serves because compliance has been wired into its neurology across thousands of generations of selective pressure. A crow cooperates because it has calculated that cooperation is currently advantageous. The decision is made fresh every morning. It is revised continuously, and it can be revoked without notice. In Moscow, hooded crows have been documented sledding down snow-covered rooftops on improvised sleds using jar lids, scraps of cardboard, and pieces of bark. They carry the object to the top of the slope, ride it to the bottom, retrieve it, and carry it back to the top. The behavior has no foraging function. It has no survival value. It is play. Voluntary, self-directed, repeated recreational activity in an animal whose brain weighs less than a AA battery. These urban populations are not becoming tamer. They are not drifting toward a domestication threshold through prolonged contact with human environments. They are becoming more cognitively sophisticated, innovating new solutions to novel challenges at a rate that matches or exceeds the rate at which human cities generate new complexities. They are adapting to us at the speed of culture, not the speed of genetics, and they are accomplishing it without sacrificing a single neuron to the domestication trade. The question at the center of this story reaches beyond crows, beyond birds, beyond the mechanics of selective breeding. It reaches into the assumption embedded in the word domestication itself. Humans frame the process as a conquest. We selected. We reshaped. We bent wild genetics into obedient forms and built every agricultural civilization on the result. For chickens and sheep and cattle and dogs, that framing holds. Those species were remade. They carry smaller brains, narrower behavioral repertoires, and a biological dependence on human infrastructure that would make independent survival in the wild nearly impossible for most breeds. Crows examined the same arrangement and refused it. Not by retreating to uninhabited wilderness, not by becoming dangerous or elusive. They refused by remaining exactly where they were, inside human civilization, eating from its margins, nesting on its structures, monitoring its inhabitants with a facial recognition system more persistent than any surveillance camera, and retaining every gram of the neural tissue that domestication would have demanded they surrender. They found a way to extract every benefit of human proximity without paying the cognitive price that every other commensal species has paid. And the tool they used to accomplish this was the same tool that domestication would have destroyed. The real question was never why humans failed to domesticate crows. Humans domesticated ostriches that can disembowel a grown man. They domesticated geese that attack on sight. They domesticated turkeys so neurologically diminished that commercial breeds can drown by looking up during rainfall. Difficulty was never the barrier. The real question is whether a species intelligent enough to recognize individual human faces, to hold multi-generational grudges, to conduct collective threat assessments over the bodies of their dead, to manufacture tools and transmit the designs culturally, to read traffic signals and time their movements to the rhythm of machines they did not build. Looked at every domesticated animal on this planet, at the shrunken brains and the floppy ears, and the absolute dependence on a species that could withdraw its protection at any moment, and made a decision. Not a conscious one. Evolution does not deliberate, but a decision encoded in the outcome nonetheless. Every bird that humans ever tamed paid paid for its safety with its mind. Crows found a way to keep both, because intelligence, past a certain threshold, is not a trait that can be bargained away. It is the only thing standing between the animal and extinction. And a species that has survived for 17 million years by being smarter than everything around it does not volunteer to become dumber, no matter what you offer in return. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer Brook Explains is built for. Hit subscribe. Every week, we cover the science, the history, and the buried mechanisms behind the world you thought you already understood. The next video is on screen now, and it connects directly to what you just watched.